In 1973, a 7-year-old boy vanished without a trace from his family's home. No ransom demands came, no witnesses emerged, no body was ever found. But 40 years later, a grainy cell phone video would surface from halfway around the world, showing a man sweeping the dusty streets of a remote Ugandan village. A man whose face would send shockwaves through a family that had never stopped searching, never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that somewhere, somehow, their lost child was still alive. The video lasted only 17 seconds. The quality was poor, the image shaky, captured by a humanitarian worker documenting conditions in rural East Africa. But for Margaret Williams, sitting in her kitchen in Detroit on a cold February morning in 2013, watching her laptop screen through tears that had been building for 4 decades, those 17 seconds would change everything. The man in the video moved with a familiar gait, held his shoulders in a way she recognized despite the years, despite the continent between them, despite every rational voice telling her it was impossible. That man was supposed to be her son, Jerome. Margaret had been 32 when Jerome disappeared, a single mother working double shifts at the Ford plant to keep food on the table for her 3 children. Jerome was the middle child, quiet where his siblings were loud, thoughtful where they were impulsive. The one who would sit for hours arranging his toy cars in perfect lines, while his older brother Marcus and younger sister Denise raced around the small apartment they called home on Detroit's East Side. The morning of September 15, 1973, had started like any other. Margaret left for her early shift at 6, kissing each of her sleeping children goodbye, leaving 13-year-old Marcus in charge with strict instructions about getting Jerome to school and making sure Denise ate her breakfast. She had done this routine hundreds of times. Marcus was responsible for his age, Jerome was obedient, Denise was manageable when her brothers were watching. Nothing should have gone wrong, but when Margaret returned home that evening, her world collapsed. Marcus met her at the door, his face streaked with tears, his words tumbling over each other in a panic that made her blood turn cold. Jerome hadn't come home from school. Marcus had waited until almost dark before calling their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had helped him search the neighborhood. They had checked every yard, every alley, every place a 7-year-old might hide or play or get lost. Jerome was simply gone. The police response was swift but ultimately fruitless. Detective Robert Hayes, a weary man in his 50s who had seen too many missing children cases, canvassed the neighborhood with methodical thoroughness. Every house was searched. Every resident was questioned. Jerome's school confirmed he had never arrived that morning, though 3 different neighbors remembered seeing him walking toward the bus stop at his usual time. The bus driver, when finally tracked down, insisted no child matching Jerome's description had boarded his bus that day. It was as if Jerome had walked into thin air somewhere between his front door and the corner of Mack Avenue, a distance of less than 2 blocks through a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business. The initial investigation consumed weeks. Margaret took leave from work, spending every waking hour distributing flyers with Jerome's school picture, his gap-toothed smile beaming from photocopied pages that soon covered every telephone pole and storefront window in a 10-mile radius. The local news picked up the story, running segments about the missing boy that generated dozens of tips, each one investigated thoroughly, each one leading nowhere. There were the usual suspects, the usual theories. The registered sex offender who lived 6 blocks away and had an airtight alibi. The transient who had been seen in the neighborhood the week before but had moved on before Jerome's disappearance. The possibility that Jerome had run away. Though everyone who knew him agreed this was completely out of character for a child who had never spent a night away from his mother's side. Detective Hayes worked the case with a dedication that surprised even him. There was something about Margaret Williams, about the quiet dignity with which she faced each dead end, each false hope, each brutal disappointment that kept him pushing when other cases might have been relegated to the cold case. Files. He interviewed and re-interviewed everyone who had any connection to the family. He expanded the search radius. He coordinated with neighboring police departments. He spent his own time and money following leads that officially didn't warrant the resources. But as autumn turned to winter and winter gave way to spring, the leads dried up. The media attention faded. The community's intense focus shifted to other tragedies, other crises. Margaret returned to work because she had to, because bills needed paying, and her other children needed feeding. But part of her remained frozen in that September morning when she had kissed Jerome goodbye without knowing it would be the last time. Marcus aged rapidly in the months following his brother's disappearance, carrying a burden of guilt that no 13-year-old should have to bear. He blamed himself for not walking Jerome to the bus stop, for assuming his responsible little brother would make the journey safely, as he had dozens of times before. Denise, only 5 when Jerome vanished, grew up in the shadow of a ghost, in a house where an empty bedroom remained exactly as it had been the day their brother disappeared, where their mother's eyes held a sadness that never fully lifted, where the unspoken question of what if haunted every family gathering, every birthday, every Christmas. Years passed. Margaret never stopped looking. She attended every support group meeting for families of missing children. She maintained contact with Detective Hayes even after he retired, even after the case was officially designated cold. She updated Jerome's missing person information annually, aging his photograph using computer software that showed what he might look like at 10, at 15, at 21. She never moved from the house on the east side, maintaining the same phone number, the same address, just in case he ever tried to come home. Margaret remarried in 1981 to a gentleman named Thomas, who understood that loving her meant accepting the ghost of her missing son. Thomas never tried to replace Jerome in the family dynamic, never suggested removing his photographs from the living room walls, never hinted that perhaps it was time to convert his bedroom into something more practical. When Margaret wanted to spend weekends driving to neighboring states to follow up on reported sightings that usually turned out to be other people's children, Thomas packed a cooler and came along. Marcus grew up to become a police officer himself, partly motivated by his brother's case, partly driven by a need to help other families avoid the agony his own had endured. He specialized in missing persons investigations, bringing an empathy and persistence to the work that his colleagues both admired and worried about. He never forgot that every case file represented a family like his own, a mother like Margaret, siblings like himself and Denise, people whose lives had been irrevocably altered by an absence that defied explanation. Denise became a social worker, drawn to helping vulnerable children who reminded her of the brother she barely remembered, but whose absence had shaped her entire life. She married young and had 3 children of her own, but found herself constantly vigilant, perhaps overprotective, unable to shake the knowledge that children could simply vanish, that the ordinary act of walking to a school bus could somehow lead to 40 years of questions without answers. The family's dynamic centered around this void, this missing piece that influenced every decision, every celebration, every moment of happiness that was tinged with the awareness that Jerome wasn't there to share it. They learned to live with the uncertainty, but they never learned to accept it. Margaret continued to light a candle for Jerome every year on his birthday, continued to buy him Christmas presents that accumulated in his closet, continued to introduce herself to strangers by saying she had 3 children, even though only 2 were accounted for. Detective Hayes, even in retirement, never completely let go of the case. He had worked hundreds of missing person investigations during his career, but Jerome Williams remained the one that haunted him. The case that represented every limit of police work, every frustrating dead end that reminded him how often the system failed the people who needed it most. He kept his own copies of the case files, his own collection of tips and leads that had never been fully explored. He stayed in touch with Margaret, calling every few months to check in, to let her know he hadn't forgotten, to share any new developments in missing person investigation techniques that might offer hope. In 2005, 32 years after Jerome's disappearance, DNA testing had advanced enough to re-examine physical evidence from the original investigation. Margaret allowed herself to hope that perhaps some trace of her son might be found, some genetic proof that could either confirm his death or provide a new direction for the search. But the testing revealed nothing useful. No DNA evidence that hadn't already been accounted for, no breakthrough that would crack the case wide open. The disappointment was crushing in a way that surprised Margaret. She had lived with disappointment for decades, had learned to manage her expectations, had built psychological defenses against hope. But the promise of science, of technology that hadn't existed when Jerome first vanished, had temporarily lowered those defenses. When the DNA results proved inconclusive, she felt the loss as freshly as she had 40 years earlier. It was Detective Hayes who first saw the video. His nephew worked for a non-profit organization that provided clean water infrastructure to rural African communities. During a 2013 deployment to Uganda, the young man had filmed several short videos documenting conditions in the villages where they worked, partly for his own memories, partly to show family and friends back home the impact of their humanitarian work. The nephew was scrolling through his phone videos during a family dinner when Hayes happened to be looking over his shoulder. Most of the footage showed the expected scenes: children playing near newly installed water pumps, village leaders expressing gratitude for the improved infrastructure, scenic shots of the countryside. But one brief video, filmed almost as an afterthought, showed a man sweeping the main dirt road through the village center. Hayes felt something click in his brain, a recognition so immediate and visceral that he asked his nephew to replay the video several times. The man in the footage was African, clearly had been living in the country for many years, spoke what sounded like fluent local dialect to children who ran past, but there was something about his movement, his posture, his facial structure when he briefly looked up at the camera that reminded Hayes of a 7-year-old boy whose photograph he had studied for decades. The rational part of Hayes's mind immediately began listing all the reasons why this was impossible. A 7-year-old American child could not simply vanish from Detroit and reappear 40 years later as an adult man in rural Uganda. The logistics alone were incomprehensible. The distances involved, the cultural barriers, the language differences, the lack of any apparent connection between Jerome's disappearance and international travel or adoption or human trafficking, all suggested that this was simply a case of an old man's wishful thinking, of seeing patterns where none existed. But Hayes had learned to trust his instincts during 4 decades of police work. He had solved cases by following hunches that seemed illogical, by pursuing connections that other investigators had dismissed. And something about this 17-second video had triggered every investigative instinct he possessed. He asked his nephew for copies of all the videos from the Uganda trip, along with detailed information about the location where they had been filmed. The village was called Kiryandongo, located in the central part of the country, about 2 hours north of the capital city. It was home to approximately 3,000 people, most of whom survived through subsistence farming and small-scale trade. The humanitarian organization had been working there for several months, installing water pumps and latrines, training local residents in maintenance and sanitation practices. Hayes spent hours studying the brief footage, enhancing it with video, software he had learned to use during his final years on the police force. The man in the video appeared to be in his 40s, which would be approximately correct for Jerome's age. His height and build were consistent with what computer modeling had suggested Jerome might look like as an adult. Most compelling was his facial structure, particularly around the eyes and cheekbones, which bore a striking resemblance to childhood photographs of Jerome. But resemblance was not proof. Hayes had seen dozens of men over the years who bore some similarity to the missing boy, had followed up on hundreds of tips from people who were certain they had spotted Jerome in grocery stores, at bus stations, walking down streets in distant cities. Every single one had turned out to be someone else, and the accumulation of these false hopes had taught him to be cautious about jumping to conclusions. Still, this felt different. The geographic distance, paradoxically, made it more credible, rather than less. A child abducted from Detroit might realistically be taken anywhere within the continental United States, but Africa seemed too remote, too unlikely for anyone to fabricate such a connection. If someone had wanted to create a false Jerome sighting, they would choose a more plausible location. Hayes decided to contact Margaret before pursuing the lead any further. He owed her that courtesy, owed her the chance to view the video and make her own assessment before he invested time and resources in what might turn out to be another dead end. He had learned over the years that families of missing persons needed to maintain some control over their own hope, needed to be partners in the investigation rather than passive recipients of information. Margaret was working in her garden when Hayes called, pulling weeds from the flower bed she maintained in memory of Jerome. She had planted it the 10th anniversary of his disappearance, choosing flowers that bloomed in September, creating something beautiful from the anniversary that had become the most difficult day of each year. Thomas was inside, watching television. Marcus was at work. Denise was picking up her children from school. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in February when the phone rang and changed everything. Hayes explained about the video carefully, emphasizing the preliminary nature of the lead, warning Margaret against investing too much hope in what might turn out to be another false alarm. But even through his caution, Margaret could hear something different in his voice, an excitement he was trying to contain but couldn't completely suppress. She listened to his description of the man in the video, of the facial similarities he had observed, of the age and physical characteristics that seemed to match. When Hayes offered to email her the video, Margaret found herself suddenly afraid to see it. For 40 years, she had trained herself to hope cautiously, to protect her heart against the crushing disappointment of false leads. But something about this conversation felt different, felt more promising than anything she had experienced. Since those first frantic weeks after Jerome's disappearance, she was terrified that watching the video would either destroy this fragile hope or, worse, nurture it beyond her ability to cope with another disappointment. But she also knew she had no choice. She had spent 4 decades wondering what had happened to her son, and any potential answer, no matter how unlikely, demanded investigation. She gave Hayes her email address and asked him to send the video immediately. Before she could lose her nerve, Margaret called Thomas inside before opening the email. She needed him there, needed his steady presence and rational perspective, needed someone who could help her interpret what she was about to see. They sat together at the kitchen table, the laptop positioned between them, the video file waiting to be opened. The first viewing was overwhelming. Margaret saw the man sweeping the street and felt her heart stop, felt 40 years of grief and hope and desperate love surge through her body so powerfully that she couldn't breathe. The resemblance was undeniable, but resemblance had fooled her before. She watched the video again and again, studying every detail, every movement, every angle of the man's face and body. Thomas, ever practical, pointed out the obstacles to accepting this identification. The man spoke what appeared to be a local African language. He moved through the village with the familiarity of someone who had lived there for years. He interacted with local children in ways that suggested deep community integration. How could a 7-year-old American boy have ended up in rural Uganda, learned the local culture and language, built a life completely disconnected from his origins? But Margaret saw something else in the video, something that bypassed rational analysis and spoke directly to her maternal instincts. The way the man held his head when he concentrated on his work, the slight favor of his left leg that reminded her of Jerome's childhood limp from a playground accident, the unconscious gesture he made when brushing hair from his forehead, a movement so familiar it made her gasp. She called Marcus and Denise, asked them to come over immediately without explaining why. She needed their perspectives, needed other family members who had known Jerome to view the video and offer their opinions. She also needed their support, because she was beginning to believe something that seemed impossible but felt undeniably true. Marcus arrived first, still in uniform from his shift. Margaret showed him the video without preamble, watched his face carefully as he studied the grainy footage. Marcus had inherited his mother's careful nature, her instinct to protect herself against false hope. But she saw his expression change. As he watched, saw the same recognition that had hit her like a physical blow. Denise arrived 20 minutes later with her 3 children, expecting a normal family dinner, unprepared for the bombshell that awaited her. She watched the video with tears streaming down her face, seeing in the man's movements and gestures echoes of the brother she had lost before she was old enough to form complete memories of him. The 3 of them sat around the kitchen table, watching the 17-second video repeatedly, debating what they were seeing, trying to balance hope against the harsh lessons of 40 years of disappointment. Marcus suggested enhancing the video further, perhaps consulting with forensic experts who specialized in facial recognition. Denise wondered about the legal and practical challenges of pursuing a lead in a foreign country, of making contact with someone who might not even remember his original identity. Margaret knew they needed professional help, needed investigators, with international experience and resources she couldn't access on her own. But she also knew that pursuing this lead would require emotional reserves she wasn't sure she possessed. After 40 years of living with uncertainty, the possibility of definitive answers, whether positive or negative, felt almost too overwhelming to contemplate. Hayes, meanwhile, had been conducting his own preliminary investigation. He contacted his nephew's humanitarian organization, gathering more detailed information about the village where the video had been filmed. He learned that Kiryandongo had a complex history, that it had served as a refugee settlement for displaced persons from various conflicts throughout East Africa. He discovered that the area had housed significant refugee populations during the 1970s and 1980s, including people fleeing civil wars in neighboring countries. This information suggested a possible explanation for how an American child might have ended up in rural Uganda. If Jerome had been abducted and somehow transported to Africa during the chaotic period following major regional conflicts, he could have been placed in refugee camps or settlements where documentation was minimal and survival was more important than maintaining records of origins. Hayes also researched international adoption and trafficking patterns from the 1970s, looking for any precedent that might explain Jerome's journey from Detroit to Uganda. What he found was disturbing but illuminating. The decade following Jerome's disappearance had seen significant growth in both legal and illegal international adoption networks, some of which had operated with minimal oversight and questionable documentation practices. More troubling were the documented cases of child trafficking that had moved American children to foreign countries for various purposes, including illegal adoption, labor exploitation, and worse. While these cases were relatively rare, They established that the geographic distance between Detroit and Uganda, while vast, was not impossible to traverse for someone with the proper resources and connections. Armed with this background research, Hayes contacted the FBI's International Operations Division, explaining the case and requesting assistance with overseas investigation. The federal response was cautious but cooperative. Agent Sarah Mitchell, who specialized in international missing persons cases, agreed to review the video and case files, though she warned that pursuing leads in foreign countries required extensive coordination with local authorities and could take months or years to resolve. Agent Mitchell's analysis of the video was thorough and sobering. She confirmed that the facial recognition software suggested a possible match with aged computer projections of Jerome's appearance. But she emphasized that such software was not reliable enough for definitive identification. She explained the legal and diplomatic challenges involved in pursuing an investigation in Uganda, the need for cooperation from local authorities, the complexity of obtaining DNA samples or other evidence from someone who might not be willing to participate in testing. But Mitchell also recognized the strength of the family's conviction, the quality of the circumstantial evidence, and the professional reputation of Detective Hayes. She agreed to initiate preliminary contact with Ugandan authorities through diplomatic channels, exploring whether an investigation could be conducted with appropriate respect for local sovereignty and the rights of the individual in question. The process that followed was excruciatingly slow. Diplomatic communications moved at a pace that frustrated Margaret's desperate need for immediate answers. Bureaucratic procedures required documentation and verification that took weeks to complete. Cultural and language barriers complicated every step of the process. Meanwhile, Margaret found herself caught between hope and terror. For 40 years, she had maintained her sanity by accepting that she might never know what happened to Jerome, by learning to live with uncertainty rather than being consumed by it. But the possibility of answers, of actually seeing her son again, had reawakened all the acute grief and desperate love she had learned to manage. She stopped sleeping regularly, spending hours each night watching the 17-second video, memorizing every detail, every movement, every gesture. She began planning for scenarios she had never allowed herself to imagine. What she would say if it really was Jerome, how she would explain 40 years of searching, whether he would remember her or want to maintain contact with the family he had been taken from as a child. Thomas watched his wife's emotional state with growing concern. He had supported her through 4 decades of hoping and grieving, had learned to navigate the complex emotions surrounding Jerome's absence, had built their marriage around accepting that Margaret's heart would always have a space reserved for her missing son. But he had never seen her this fragile, this consumed by possibility and fear. Marcus and Denise took turns staying with their mother during the weeks of waiting, providing emotional support and practical assistance. Marcus used his police contacts to stay informed about the progress of the international investigation. Denise researched trauma and memory, trying to understand what Jerome might have experienced, what his psychological state might be after 40 years of separation from his original identity. The breakthrough came in late March, nearly 2 months after Hayes had first seen the video. Agent Mitchell called Margaret directly, her voice carefully controlled, but unable to hide an underlying excitement. The Ugandan authorities had located the man from the video, had conducted a preliminary interview, and had obtained his consent for DNA testing. The man's name was Samuel Okello, and he had lived in Kiryandongo village for over 30 years. He worked as a street sweeper and general laborer, was well liked in the community, had a wife and 2 children who considered him a devoted family man. But when approached by local officials and questioned about his earliest memories, he had admitted to confusion about his origins, to dreams and flashbacks that seemed to reference a different life, a different place, a different family. Samuel had told the investigators that he believed he had come to Uganda as a young child, possibly through a refugee settlement or displacement program, but he had no clear memories of his life before arriving in the village. He had been raised by a local family who had since died, had learned the local language and customs, had built his entire adult identity around his life in Kiryandongo. But he also described recurring dreams about a woman who sang to him in a language he didn't recognize, about children who looked different from the people he had grown up with, about a place with different smells and sounds and colors than anything he had experienced in Uganda. He had always dismissed these dreams as fantasies, but the investigators' questions had made him wonder whether they might be memories. Most significantly, Samuel had agreed to provide a DNA sample for comparison with Margaret's genetic material. The sample had been properly collected and documented, following chain of custody procedures that would make the results admissible in any legal proceeding. It was being shipped to a FBI laboratory for analysis, with results expected within 2 weeks. Margaret received this news with a mixture of relief and terror that left her unable to speak for several minutes. The investigation had progressed beyond her wildest hopes, but now she faced the possibility of definitive proof one way or another. If the DNA matched, she would have found her son after 40 years of searching. If it didn't match, she would have to accept that Jerome was still lost, that this lead was just another cruel coincidence that had briefly illuminated her hope before extinguishing it forever. The 2 weeks of waiting for DNA results were the longest of Margaret's life. She tried to maintain normal routines, tried to go to work and cook dinner and tend her garden, but everything felt suspended, everything felt like marking time until she received the phone call that would either reunite her with her lost child or force her to confront the reality that he might never be found. Hayes visited every few days, ostensibly to discuss logistical details about the investigation, but really to provide emotional support and professional perspective. He reminded Margaret that even if the DNA matched, the process of reconnecting with Jerome would be complex and challenging. Samuel had built a life in Uganda, had a family and community ties that couldn't simply be abandoned. Any reunion would need to respect his current circumstances while acknowledging the trauma of his childhood separation. Agent Mitchell called. On a Friday afternoon in early April, Margaret was alone in the house, Thomas having gone to the grocery store, Marcus at work, Denise picking up her children from school. She answered the phone with hands that shook so violently she could barely press the answer button. The DNA was a match. Samuel Okello was Jerome Williams. Margaret dropped the phone and collapsed into the nearest chair, 40 years of grief and hope and desperate love crashing over her, like a dam had burst in her chest. She sobbed until she couldn't breathe, sobbed until Thomas found her 20 minutes later and held her while she tried to explain through tears that their family was about to change forever. The confirmation of Jerome's identity opened a new chapter of challenges and complications that Margaret had never anticipated. Samuel had been living as a Ugandan citizen for over 30 years, had no documentation of his American birth, had a wife and children who were terrified that he might be taken away from them by foreign authorities. He remembered almost nothing of his early childhood, had no conscious recollection of Margaret or Marcus or Denise, spoke only fragments of English mixed with the local dialects he had learned in Uganda. Agent Mitchell coordinated with State Department officials to address the legal and citizenship issues surrounding Jerome's status. Since he had been abducted as a minor and taken to Uganda without proper documentation, he remained an American citizen despite having lived abroad for 4 decades. But obtaining the paperwork to prove this status and navigating the bureaucratic requirements for travel between countries would require months of legal proceedings. More complex were the emotional and psychological challenges facing both Jerome and his American family. Dr. Patricia Holbrook, a psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery and family reunification, was brought in to help navigate the delicate process of re-establishing relationships across 4 decades of separation and cultural difference. Dr. Holbrook explained to Margaret that Jerome's amnesia regarding his early childhood was likely a protective mechanism, a psychological response to the trauma of being abducted and forcibly separated from his family at such a young age. The memories might return gradually, or they might remain permanently blocked, depending on the circumstances of his abduction and the coping strategies his mind had developed to survive the displacement. She also warned that reunion fantasies, while natural and understandable, might not match the reality of reconnecting with someone who had been essentially raised as a different person. Jerome had spent his entire conscious life as Samuel Okello, had formed his identity around Ugandan culture and relationships, had no emotional connection to the family he had been taken from as a child. Margaret understood these warnings intellectually, but emotionally she remained focused on the miraculous fact that Jerome was alive, that 40 years of searching had finally yielded an answer. She began planning for a trip to Uganda, working with travel agents and State Department officials to arrange a visit that would comply with local laws and cultural sensitivities. The first contact between Margaret and Jerome was arranged as a video call, facilitated by Agent Mitchell and local Ugandan officials who could provide translation assistance. Margaret sat in her kitchen in Detroit, surrounded by Marcus and Denise and Thomas, staring at a laptop screen that showed a man who was simultaneously her son and a stranger. Jerome, appearing on screen as Samuel, looked confused and slightly frightened by the video setup. He understood that these people claimed to be his original family, but he felt no recognition, no emotional connection to the middle-aged woman who was crying while she looked at him. When Margaret tried to speak to him directly, he responded politely but without warmth, occasionally asking for translation help from the local officials. The conversation was stilted and awkward, constrained by language barriers and the surreal nature of the situation. Margaret had imagined this moment for 40 years, but had never anticipated how strange it would feel to look at her son and see someone who didn't know her, who showed no sign of remembering anything about their shared life, who seemed more concerned about missing work than about reuniting with his birth family. But there were moments, brief flashes, when Margaret saw something familiar in Jerome's expressions. When he smiled at something the translator said, she recognized the gap between his front teeth that had made him self-conscious as a child. When he rubbed his forehead while thinking, she saw the same gesture he had made when concentrating on homework at the kitchen table. These tiny recognitions kept her hope alive even as the overall interaction felt disappointingly distant. Dr. Holbrook had warned that first contact might be difficult, that building emotional connections across such vast cultural and temporal distances would require patience and realistic expectations. She encouraged Margaret to focus on establishing trust and communication rather than expecting immediate recognition or emotional reunion. Over the following weeks, Margaret and Jerome had several more video conversations, each one slightly less awkward than the last. Jerome began to show curiosity about his American family, asking questions about Detroit, about his siblings, about the circumstances of his disappearance. He remained skeptical about many details, particularly Margaret's insistence that he had been a happy child who had never wanted to leave home. The conversations were facilitated by a professional translator who specialized in trauma-informed communication, someone who could help navigate not only language differences but also the emotional complexity of the situation. Gradually, Jerome began to share details about his life in Uganda, about the family who had raised him, about his wife and children who remained confused and worried about these foreign contacts. Margaret learned that Jerome had been brought to Uganda by what appeared to be a Catholic relief organization that was later discovered to be operating without proper authorization. He had been placed with a local family who believed they were providing temporary care for a displaced refugee child, but no follow-up contact had ever been made to reunite him with his original family or verify his background. The couple who raised Jerome had been kind but overwhelmed by their own survival needs during a period of significant regional instability. They had given him a new name, enrolled him in local schools when possible, taught him local customs and language, but had never pushed him to remember or discuss his earlier life. They had assumed he was a war orphan from a neighboring country and had focused on helping him integrate into their community rather than maintaining connections to his past. Jerome had grown up believing this narrative, accepting that his hazy early memories were simply the remnants of a traumatic displacement. He had been too young to understand clearly. He had built his entire identity around being Samuel Okello, had never questioned the gaps in his memory or the dreams that seemed to reference a different life. Margaret's determination to visit Uganda grew stronger with each video conversation. She needed to see Jerome in person, needed to spend time with him in his own environment, needed to understand the life he had built and the family he had created. But the logistics of international travel, combined with the emotional and financial costs involved, made the trip seem almost impossibly complex. Marcus and Denise pooled their resources with Margaret and Thomas to fund the journey. Marcus took leave from the police department to accompany his mother, recognizing that she needed both emotional and practical support for such a significant undertaking. They worked with Agent Mitchell and State Department officials to arrange proper documentation and coordinate with Ugandan authorities to ensure their visit would be legally appropriate and culturally respectful. The flight to Uganda took nearly 24 hours, with layovers in Amsterdam and Nairobi. Margaret had never traveled outside the United States, had barely been on an airplane before this trip, but her desperation to see Jerome overcame her anxiety about international travel. She spent the long flight studying photographs of Uganda, reading about local customs, trying to prepare herself for the cultural differences she would encounter. Kiriandongo village was smaller and more remote than Margaret had imagined, accessible only by rough dirt roads that required four-wheel drive vehicles. The humanitarian organization that had originally filmed Jerome arranged for local transportation and lodging, setting up the visit to minimize disruption to the community while providing appropriate privacy for family interactions. Margaret's first in-person meeting with Jerome took place at the local community center, a simple concrete building that served as a gathering place for village events. Jerome arrived wearing his best clothes, clearly nervous about the encounter, accompanied by his wife Rachel and their two children, a teenage daughter named Grace and a younger son named Peter. The initial moments were overwhelming for everyone involved. Margaret looked at Jerome and saw unmistakably her son, 40 years older but bearing the same basic facial structure, the same way of holding himself, the same unconscious gestures she remembered from childhood. But Jerome looked at Margaret and saw a stranger, someone whose emotions about him seemed disproportionate to their lack of shared experience. Rachel and the children were polite but wary, uncertain about these foreign visitors who claimed a connection to their husband and father that threatened to disrupt their family stability. They had lived their entire lives in the village, had never traveled more than a few miles from home, had no context for understanding the complex emotions and legal implications surrounding Jerome's dual identity. Dr. Holbrook had recommended that Margaret focus on learning about Jerome's current life, rather than trying to resurrect memories of his childhood, and this approach proved wise. As Jerome showed her around the village, introduced her to his friends and neighbors, explained his work and daily routines, Margaret began to understand the man he had become, rather than mourning the child he had been. Jerome was respected in the community for his reliability and kindness. He worked multiple jobs to support his family, sweeping streets in the morning, helping with construction projects in the afternoon, farming a small plot of land that provided vegetables for household consumption. He attended the local church, regularly served as a translator for visiting aid workers, had earned a reputation for honesty and hard work that made him a valued community member. His wife Rachel had married him 15 years earlier, drawn to his gentle nature and steady employment. She had known about his unclear origins, but had never questioned the details, accepting that many people in their region had complicated histories related to regional conflicts and displacement. Their children knew him simply as their father, a loving and attentive parent who told them stories and helped with homework and worked hard to provide for their needs. Margaret spent a week in the village, staying in a small guest house run by the humanitarian organization, visiting with Jerome and his family each day, slowly building the foundation for a relationship that transcended their shared genetics but acknowledged their lack of shared experience. She brought photographs of Jerome's childhood, hoping they might trigger memories, but his reactions remained politely interested rather than emotionally engaged. More successful were the stories Margaret told about family traditions, about holiday celebrations, about the siblings who had grown up wondering what happened to their brother. Jerome seemed particularly interested in learning about Marcus's career in law enforcement, about Denise's work with children, about the ways their family had been shaped by his absence. On the fourth day of her visit, Jerome mentioned a recurring dream he had experienced since childhood, a dream about a woman singing a song he couldn't quite remember. Margaret asked him to describe what he could recall of the melody, and when he hummed a few uncertain notes, she recognized the lullaby she had sung to him every night as a child, a song she had continued to hum on his birthday each year for 40 years. This moment of recognition was the closest they came to an emotional breakthrough during Margaret's visit. Jerome stared at her as she sang the complete lullaby, his expression shifting from polite interest to something deeper, something that might have been the beginning of actual memory. He didn't cry, didn't embrace her, didn't suddenly remember everything, but something in his face suggested that the song had unlocked a door in his mind that had been closed for 4 decades. Margaret's departure from Uganda was bittersweet. She had found her son alive and well, had seen that he had built a good life with people who loved him, had established the foundation for ongoing contact and relationship. But she was also leaving without the emotional reunion she had dreamed of, without the immediate recognition and relief she had imagined, without the simple resolution that would allow her to close this chapter of grief and move forward with uncomplicated joy. Jerome walked her to the vehicle that would take her back to the airport, and for the first time, he initiated physical contact, giving her a brief hug that felt more like politeness than affection, but still represented an acknowledgement of their connection. He promised to stay in touch through video calls, to share photographs of his family, to continue learning about his American origins while maintaining his Ugandan life. The flight home gave Margaret 24 hours to process what she had experienced, to integrate the reality of finding Jerome with the fantasy of reunion she had carried for 40 years. She felt simultaneously fulfilled and disappointed, grateful and sad, complete and somehow still searching. Marcus, who had accompanied her to Uganda, helped her understand that their week in the village represented the beginning of a new relationship, rather than the completion of an old one. Jerome would always be her son, but he was also Samuel Okello, husband to Rachel, father to Grace and Peter, member of a community that had shaped him for most of his life. Any ongoing relationship would need to honor both of these identities, rather than demanding that he choose between them. Back in Detroit, Margaret faced the challenge of explaining to friends and extended family what she had discovered. The miraculous fact that Jerome was alive generated excitement and joy from people who had supported her through 40 years of searching. But the complex reality of his circumstances, his lack of clear memories, his established life in Uganda, required more nuanced explanations than most people were prepared to hear. Margaret worked with Dr. Holbrook to process her own mixed emotions about the reunion. She had spent 4 decades hoping to find Jerome, but had never adequately prepared for the possibility that finding him might not provide the emotional closure she expected. Learning to love the man Jerome had become, rather than mourning the child he had been, required psychological adjustment that was both harder and more rewarding than she had anticipated. The ongoing relationship between the American and Ugandan branches of the family developed slowly but steadily. Margaret and Jerome had weekly video calls that gradually became more comfortable and natural. She sent care packages with items that were difficult to obtain in rural Uganda, photographs of family gatherings he couldn't attend, updates about Marcus's and Denise's lives and children. Jerome began sharing more details about his daily life, his work, his hopes for his children's education and future opportunities. He expressed interest in learning more English, in understanding American culture, in maintaining connections with his birth family while preserving the relationships and community ties that had sustained him for 40 years. 6 months after Margaret's visit to Uganda, Jerome experienced a breakthrough in memory recovery that surprised everyone involved. While helping Grace with a school project about family history, he spontaneously recalled specific details about the morning of his disappearance, details that matched exactly with the police reports and witness statements from 1973. He remembered walking toward the bus stop, remembered a man approaching him with a story about his mother being hurt and needing help. He remembered getting into a car, remembered a long journey that seemed to last forever, remembered arriving at a place that looked nothing like Detroit. The memories were fragmentary and emotional rather than linear and factual, but they provided the first clear confirmation of abduction rather than voluntary disappearance. This memory recovery was both healing and traumatic for Jerome. On one hand, it validated his growing sense of connection to his American family, provided context for the dreams and flashbacks he had experienced throughout his life. On the other hand, it forced him to confront the reality that he had been violently separated from his family, that his entire life had been built on the foundation of a crime that had never been solved. Margaret received news of Jerome's memory breakthrough with complex emotions. Learning that her son had indeed been abducted provided closure on questions that had haunted her for 40 years, but it also renewed her anger about the crime that had been committed against their family. She contacted Detective Hayes and Agent Mitchell to share Jerome's recovered memories, hoping that new information might provide leads for investigating the original abduction. The investigation into Jerome's kidnapping was reopened as a cold case with international implications. FBI agents interviewed Jerome via video call, carefully documenting his recovered memories and comparing them with evidence from the original investigation. Unfortunately, the 40-year gap meant that most potential witnesses had died or disappeared, that physical evidence had been lost or degraded, that the trail of whoever had taken Jerome and transported him to Uganda had gone completely cold. But the investigation did uncover evidence of an illegal adoption and trafficking network that had operated during the 1970s, moving American children to various foreign countries for placement with families who believed they were participating in legitimate refugee assistance programs. Jerome appeared to have been one of several children processed through this network, though the organization responsible had disbanded decades earlier and its principals had never been prosecuted. While legal justice for Jerome's kidnapping seemed unlikely, after 40 years, the family found emotional resolution in understanding what had happened and in building new relationships that honored both Jerome's American origins and his Ugandan life. Margaret established a scholarship fund for Grace and Peter, Jerome's children, providing them with educational opportunities that would allow them to choose their own futures while remaining connected to their local community. Marcus and Denise both traveled to Uganda the following year, meeting their brother and his family, spending time in the village that had become his home, developing their own relationships with him that weren't based on childhood memories he couldn't access. These visits helped establish Jerome's place in the extended family while respecting the life he had built in Africa. 2 years after Margaret's initial trip to Uganda, Jerome expressed interest in visiting the United States to see the place where he had been born, to meet extended family members who remembered him as a child, to understand the American part of his identity while maintaining his commitment to his Ugandan family. The logistics of this visit required extensive coordination with immigration authorities, since Jerome's citizenship status remained complicated despite his American birth. Agent Mitchell worked with State Department officials to arrange proper documentation for Jerome's travel, including a passport that acknowledged both his birth name and the identity he had maintained for 40 years. The process took months of bureaucratic navigation, but eventually Jerome was able to obtain the documents necessary for international travel. Jerome's visit to Detroit was scheduled for 2 weeks in the autumn, timed to coincide with the 43rd anniversary of his disappearance. Margaret prepared for his arrival with excitement and anxiety that matched what she had felt before her trip to Uganda, uncertain how he would react to seeing the place where his life had begun, unsure whether the visit would strengthen their relationship or highlight the cultural and experiential differences that separated them. The reunion at Detroit Metro Airport was emotional but restrained, reflecting the cautious affection that had developed between Margaret and Jerome over 2 years of video calls and gradual relationship building. Jerome seemed overwhelmed by the size and complexity of the airport, by the crowds and noise and technological sophistication that contrasted sharply with his rural Ugandan environment. Margaret drove him to the house where he had lived as a child. Now much changed from the neighborhood he would have known in 1973. The urban decay and population loss that had affected much of Detroit meant that many of the landmarks from his childhood had disappeared, but the basic street layout remained familiar from police reports and witness statements he had studied during the investigation. Standing in front of the house where he had lived for the first 7 years of his life, Jerome experienced another wave of memory recovery, recalling details about the front porch where he had played with toy cars, the bedroom he had shared with Marcus, the kitchen where Margaret had made breakfast before leaving for her early shift at the factory. These memories were still fragmentary and emotional rather than complete, but they provided a deeper sense of connection to his American identity. Margaret had preserved Jerome's childhood bedroom exactly as it had been the day he disappeared, maintaining it as a shrine to her missing son for 43 years. Seeing his toys and clothes and books unchanged after nearly half a century proved overwhelming for Jerome in ways he hadn't anticipated. He sat on the small bed and wept for the childhood that had been stolen from him, for the family relationships that had been severed by violence, for the person he might have become if he had never been taken. But he also expressed gratitude for the life he had built in Uganda, for Rachel and Grace and Peter, for the community that had welcomed and supported him, for the experiences and perspectives that had shaped him into the man he had become. He didn't regret his Ugandan life, didn't wish it away in favor of an American alternative, but he mourned the choice that had been taken from him. The opportunity to know both cultures and decide for himself where he belonged. Jerome's 2 weeks in Detroit included visits with extended family members who remembered him as a child, meetings with community members who had participated in the original search, conversations with Detective Hayes and other officials who had worked on his case. He toured the Ford plant where Margaret had worked, saw the schools Marcus and Denise had attended, visited the church where the family had prayed for his safe return. Each of these experiences contributed to Jerome's understanding of his American identity, while reinforcing his appreciation for the Ugandan life that had shaped his adult character. He began to see himself not as someone choosing between two cultures, but as someone who had been blessed with connections to both, someone whose unique experience bridged continents and communities in ways that few people ever experienced. The most meaningful part of Jerome's visit was the time he spent with Marcus and Denise, building relationships with siblings who had grown up shaped by his absence, but who welcomed him back with love that transcended their lack of shared memories. Marcus showed Jerome his police work, explaining how his brother's disappearance had influenced his career choice and investigative style. Denise introduced Jerome to her children, his American nieces and nephews, who had heard stories about their lost uncle but were meeting him for the first time. These family interactions helped Jerome understand the ripple effects of his abduction, the ways his disappearance had influenced every member of his family for over 4 decades. But they also demonstrated the resilience and love that had sustained the family through their loss, the strength that had enabled them to maintain hope and eventually find healing. Jerome's departure from Detroit was easier than Margaret's departure from Uganda had been, partly because they had established a pattern of regular communication, partly because the relationship between them had evolved beyond the desperate hope and fear that had characterized their early interactions. They hugged goodbye with genuine affection, promising to continue their weekly video calls, making plans for Margaret to visit Uganda again the following year. The ongoing relationship between Jerome and his American family continued to develop. In the months following his visit to Detroit, Grace and Peter, his Ugandan children, began learning English through online programs Margaret arranged and funded. Rachel participated in video calls with the American family, gradually developing her own relationships with Jerome's siblings and mother. Margaret learned basic phrases in Luganda, Jerome's local language, and incorporated Ugandan cultural elements into family celebrations. 3 years after their initial reunion, the relationship between Jerome's 2 families had evolved into something unprecedented but functional, a transnational extended family that honored multiple cultures, languages, and traditions while maintaining strong emotional bonds across continents. Jerome remained Samuel Okello in Uganda and became Jerome Williams again during his video calls with Detroit, code-switching between identities with increasing comfort and skill. Margaret found peace in this arrangement in ways she had never anticipated. When she first began searching for her missing son, she had imagined reunion as a return to the family structure that had existed before Jerome's disappearance. But what she had found instead was something richer and more complex. A family that had grown beyond its original boundaries, that included people and cultures she had never known existed, that demonstrated love's ability to transcend geography and time and trauma. On the 50th anniversary of Jerome's disappearance, Margaret organized a celebration that included both families via video call, bringing together Detroit and Uganda in real time to mark not the tragedy of separation, but the miracle of reconnection. Jerome, now in his late 50s, had grey hair and laugh lines that made him look more like the man Margaret had imagined he might become. Grace was preparing for university. Peter was excelling in secondary school. Rachel had become a respected Community leader in her own right, Margaret, now in her 80s, reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. She had spent 40 years searching for her lost child and had found instead a man who was simultaneously her son and a stranger, someone who carried her genetics and his father's temperament, but had been shaped by experiences and cultures completely foreign to her own background. The search for Jerome had taught Margaret about the arbitrary nature of family, about the difference between biological connection and emotional relationship, about love's ability to adapt and grow and transcend circumstances that seem impossible. She had learned to love Jerome not as the child she remembered, but as the man he had become, honoring both his American origins and his Ugandan identity. Detective Hayes, now in his 90s and in failing health, considered Jerome's case the most meaningful success of his career, not because it had resulted in criminal prosecution or legal resolution, but because it had demonstrated the power of persistence and hope in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. He had learned that solving a case didn't always mean finding answers to every question, but sometimes meant finding enough truth to allow healing and closure. Agent Mitchell continued to work on international missing persons cases using lessons learned from Jerome's investigation to improve protocols for cross-border searches and family reunification. She spoke frequently at conferences about the challenges and opportunities of international investigations, using Jerome's story as an example of what was possible when multiple agencies and countries cooperated in pursuit of humanitarian goals. Jerome himself had become something of a local celebrity in both Uganda and Detroit, representing hope for other families dealing with missing persons cases, demonstrating that separation and trauma could be overcome through patience and love and determination. He traveled occasionally between countries, serving as a bridge between cultures, helping other international adoption and trafficking survivors navigate the complex process of identity recovery and family reunification. Most importantly, Jerome had learned to see his unusual life story not as a tragedy of loss and displacement, but as a unique opportunity to experience multiple cultures, to build relationships across continents, to demonstrate humanity's capacity for adaptation and resilience. He had been taken from one family as a child and had found another, had lost one identity and had built another, had survived trauma that might have destroyed someone else and had emerged as a bridge between worlds. Margaret's search for Jerome had ended not with the simple reunion she had imagined, but with something more complex and ultimately more rewarding. The discovery that love could transcend any distance, overcome any obstacle, adapt to any circumstance. She had found her son, but she had also found an extended family she had never expected, a cultural education she had never sought, and a testament to human resilience that renewed her faith in the possibility of healing and hope. The story of Jerome Williams, who became Samuel Okello and remained both, continues to unfold across 2 continents, 2 cultures, 2 languages, and 2 families who have learned that love is not limited by geography or time or the traumatic circumstances that sometimes separate people who belong together. In finding Jerome, Margaret had found not just her missing son, but proof that no loss is permanent, no separation final, no hope too fragile to survive the test of time. If you've enjoyed, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. It helps us more than you might think. Also, YouTube thinks you will like this video on screen, so make sure to click it.